I want to tell you something before we begin. Something I don't say in most conversations, because most conversations don't make room for it. There is a person I have known for many years, someone I have eaten meals with hundreds of times, slept beside, argued with, laughed with, sat in silence with, in the specific comfortable silence that only comes between people who have been together long enough to not need to fill it. I have watched this person grieve. I have watched them be afraid. I have seen them in the morning before they have assembled themselves for the day, when the face is soft and unguarded and the thoughts are still close to whatever the night left behind. And I do not fully know them, I am certain of this, not as a complaint or a sadness, just as a fact, as clear and permanent as the fact that I do not fully know myself. There are rooms in that person I have never entered, versions of their interior life that surface only when I am not present, feelings they have had about me that they have never said, not from dishonesty but because some feelings do not have a destination. They simply are. They move through a person and leave no forwarding address. I find this, when I sit with it honestly, not lonely but extraordinary. The person you love most in the world is a mystery that does not end. The mystery does not diminish as the years accumulate. It changes shape. Some doors open that were previously closed, but the opening of one door reveals another door further back, and then another, and eventually you understand that this is not a building you will ever map completely. It is more like a country. You can live in it your whole life and still find roads you have never taken. This is what we are going to sit with tonight, not knowing, not in the sense of ignorance or failure, but in the sense of irreducible depth. The fact that every person who has ever lived has contained a world that no other person has ever fully entered, that the distance between one consciousness and another is one of the permanent features of human existence, as fundamental as time, as structural as gravity. That we reach across this distance our whole lives, and the reaching is beautiful and the distance remains. The philosophers have thought about this for as long as there have been philosophers. So have the poets, the neuroscientists, the psychologists, the theologians. Each tradition has a different name for what stands between you and being fully known. The gap, the opacity, the private self, the unconscious, the ineffable, the soul. But they are all pointing at the same phenomenon, that human beings are, at their core, unknowable to each other in a way that is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be understood. Tonight we are going to try to understand it. We are going to walk through what philosophy has said about the self and its hiddenness, what neuroscience has found about the layers of mind that even you cannot access, what literature and psychology have discovered about the particular loneliness and the particular beauty of being a person that no one else can entirely reach. We are going to go slowly. This is a subject that does not reward rushing. But before we begin, if these long, quiet investigations of the things that matter but rarely get said help you settle your mind and arrive more gently at sleep, please like this video and subscribe to Aphelion. It helps other people who are lying awake with these same unspoken questions find their way here, and leave a comment. If something moves you tonight, not an analysis, just a word, a line, whatever the conversation leaves behind. I read them. More than that, I keep them. There is something I cannot quite articulate about reading. At all hours, the responses of people in different countries, different languages, different lives, all arriving at the same place. The edge of sleep, the edge of the question of what it means to be a self that other selves cannot fully reach. We are none of us entirely known, and we are none of us entirely alone. Let's begin. There is a philosophical problem so old and so persistent that it has its own name in almost every tradition that has thought seriously about the mind. The problem is this: you cannot directly access another person's experience. You can observe their behavior. You can read their face, hear their words, watch their hands. You can build a model of what they are thinking and feeling that is sophisticated enough to allow you to predict their behavior, to anticipate their needs, to love them. But the model is not the thing. The behavior is not the experience. The face is not the interior. Between your consciousness and another person's consciousness, there is a gap that no instrument has ever bridged, and no relationship has ever fully closed. The philosopher Thomas Nagel described this in a famous 1974 essay whose title has become shorthand for the problem. What is it like to be a bat? His argument was precise. A bat navigates by echolocation. It emits high-frequency sounds and constructs a picture of its environment from the returning echoes. We can know everything about the neuroscience and physics of echolocation. We can understand exactly how the bat's brain processes the returning signals. We can become world experts on the biology of bat navigation, And we still will not know what it is like to be a bat perceiving the world through echolocation. We will not know the subjective texture of that experience, whether it is dark or bright, whether it is more like seeing or more like touching, whether it is accompanied by something like pleasure or merely information. The what it is like is inaccessible to us. It belongs inalienably to the bat. Nagel's essay was ostensibly about consciousness in general, about why the hard problem of consciousness resists scientific explanation, but its implications for human relationships are immediate. Replace bat with the person you love. You can know everything behavioral, biographical, medical, psychological about another person. You can know their history and their habits and the shape of their grief and the specific sound they make when they are trying not to cry, and you still will not know what it is like to be them. Not fully, not from the inside. The what it is like is theirs. It has always been theirs. It will remain theirs when they are gone. This is not a failure of intimacy. It is the structure of intimacy. The closeness we achieve with another person is achieved across a gap that the closeness does not close. The love that grows between two people grows in the space between two irreducibly separate consciousnesses, each of which contains depths the other cannot enter. We build bridges, we do not eliminate the water. The German philosopher Wilhelm Dilthey, writing in the late 19th century, developed what he called Verstehen, understanding, as the method appropriate to the human sciences, in contrast to the explanation that works for the natural sciences. Dilthey argued that when we try to understand another person, their actions, their words, their history, their meaning, we are doing something fundamentally different from what we do when we explain a chemical reaction or a gravitational effect. We are interpreting. We are using our own experience of being a person as a lens through which to see the other person's experience of being a person. And this method, however sophisticated, however empathetic, however carefully practiced, is always approximate, always incomplete. Dilthey was not pessimistic about this. He believed that Verstehen, even as an approximation, could achieve something real, that human beings genuinely understand each other to a meaningful degree, that this understanding builds over time, that the interpretation can deepen. But he was honest about the limit. The understanding is always from the outside, always reconstructed rather than directly accessed, always missing something of the interior that only the interior can know. What Dilthey was describing is something every person in a long relationship eventually feels. The moment when you realize that the person you have been with for years is, in some specific and inarticulate way, not the person you thought you knew, not because they have changed, though they have, as everyone changes, but because a layer of them has become slightly more visible that was previously hidden, and the visibility of that layer reveals that there are others further back that you have never suspected. This is the moment that frightens some people and fascinates others, the moment when intimacy reaches a depth at which it discovers its own limit. The philosopher who spent the most sustained and honest attention on the problem of what we cannot know about other people was probably not a philosopher in the academic sense. He was a French novelist. Marcel Proust spent most of his adult life writing a novel, In Search of Lost Time, that runs to approximately 1.5 million words, and is, among other things, the most detailed investigation of human jealousy, love, and the fundamental unknowability of other people ever committed to prose. Proust was interested with an almost clinical intensity in the gap between the person as they appear and the person as they are, between the beloved as imagined and the beloved as actual. His narrator, Marcel, spends years in love with various people, Gilbert, Albertine, others, and the love is always, in Proust's account, primarily a love for an image. The image is constructed by Marcel's own imagination, projected onto a real person, and then maintained by selective attention, jealousy, and the creative work that the lover's mind performs on the beloved. The actual person, what they are thinking when he is not there, what they do when he cannot see them, what their interior life actually contains, is not accessible to him. He knows this. He is tortured by it. And the torture, in Proust's analysis, is not incidental to love but constitutive of it. The beloved is loved partly because they are opaque, because the imagination can fill in what knowledge cannot reach. Because the mystery is itself attractive is, in a certain phase of love, more attractive than any certainty could be. This is a disturbing observation, but it has a ring of truth that most people who have loved deeply will recognize. The person we love most intensely is not, in that phase of intensity, a person we know fully. They are a person whose fullness we are trying to reach, and the trying is part of what generates the intensity. The lover is always, to some degree, in love with a projection, with the person as imagined, as interpolated into the gaps that direct knowledge cannot fill. Proust does not offer this as a critique of love. He offers it as its anatomy, and the anatomy he finds is not disappointing once you accept it. The fact that you can never fully know the person you love does not make love less real. It makes it more complex, more ongoing, more alive. A love that had fully arrived at complete knowledge would be a love that had, in a certain sense, ended its journey. The incompleteness is not the failure of the love, it is the fuel, but Proust was also honest about the cost. The person who loves deeply and who takes seriously the unknowability of the beloved will, at certain points, feel the specific anguish of that unknowability as a form of loss. Not loss of the person, they are still there, but loss of the certainty that was never really available, the complete knowledge that was never really possible, the anguish of loving someone who will always at some level remain a stranger. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas spent his career arguing that this strangeness, what he called the alterity, the otherness of the other person, is not a problem to be overcome but the foundation of ethics. The other person is not an extension of your world. They are not a version of you. They are radically, irreducibly other. They have a face in Levinas's specific philosophical sense, which means they have a claim on you that comes precisely from the fact that you cannot reduce them to your knowledge, your categories, your agenda. The face in Levinas meant this literally as well as philosophically. The face that looks at you from across the table or across the room makes an infinite demand, not because of what you know about the person, because of what you cannot know. Because behind the face is an interior that you cannot enter, a consciousness that is not yours, a what it is like that belongs to them and not to you. And this irreducible otherness is what makes them a moral being, is what makes your relationship to them ethical rather than merely instrumental. If you could fully know another person, if their interior were as accessible to you as your own, they would, in Levinas's framework, lose something essential. The unknowability is not a deficiency, it is what makes them genuinely other. And genuine otherness is the precondition for genuine relation. The neuroscience of why we cannot know each other fully turns out to be inseparable from the neuroscience of why we cannot fully know ourselves. The mind, as far as current research can determine, is largely unconscious. This is not the unconscious of Freud, or not only that, with its specific geography of repressed wishes and symbolic disguises. It is a more fundamental observation that the vast majority of the neural processing that produces your thoughts, feelings, decisions, and perceptions occurs below the threshold of awareness. You are conscious of the outputs of these processes. You are not conscious of the processes themselves. The psychologist Timothy Wilson, in his book Strangers to Ourselves, describes the adaptive unconscious as a system that operates continuously, processing enormous amounts of information, forming attitudes and judgments and intentions, and doing so without any involvement from the conscious mind. The conscious mind in Wilson's account is not the driver. It is more like the spokesperson. It narrates and explains and justifies decisions that were reached elsewhere by processes it cannot observe. This has consequences that are initially startling and eventually humbling. When you ask yourself why you made a decision, the answer you give, the explanation that feels natural and complete and accurate is, research suggests, often a post hoc construction. The actual causal processes that produced the decision were unconscious. The explanation you give is your conscious mind's best attempt to make sense of an output it did not generate. The explanation may be partly correct. It is rarely fully correct. Benjamin Libet's neuroscience experiments in the 1980s provided early empirical evidence for this. Libet asked subjects to flex their wrists spontaneously, whenever they felt like it, while he monitored both their brain activity and their subjective reports of when they felt the intention to move. He found that the brain activity associated with the movement, what he called the readiness potential, began reliably several hundred milliseconds before the subject reported feeling the intention to move. The brain was preparing the movement before the person was conscious of deciding to make it. This finding has been contested and refined extensively in the decades since. The neuroscience of will and decision is considerably more complex than Libet's original experiment suggested, and the implications for free will are less straightforward than early commentators assumed. But the underlying observation, that conscious awareness comes late to processes that are already underway, has been replicated in many contexts and in many forms. What this means for self-knowledge is significant. If you cannot fully access the processes that generate your own thoughts and decisions and feelings, then the account you give of yourself, to yourself and to others, is always incomplete. You are constructing a narrative about an interior that you can only partly see. The narrative is not false. It is based on real evidence. But it is based on partial evidence on the visible outputs of processes that run deeper than visibility. And if this is true of self-knowledge, if the self is opaque even to itself, then it follows, rather directly, that other knowledge is doubly opaque. When you try to understand another person, you are using a partly opaque self to interpret a partly opaque other. You are constructing a model with limited access to your own modeling processes of an interior you cannot directly observe, based on behavioral and verbal outputs that themselves emerge from processes the other person cannot fully access. That two people manage in these conditions to understand each other as well as they do is genuinely remarkable. The fact that marriages work, that friendships survive decades, that parents know their children and children know their parents, that strangers sometimes understand each other at first meeting more profoundly than acquaintances understand each other after years. All of this is not evidence that the unknowability problem is overstated. It is evidence of how extraordinary the human capacity for connection is, that it achieves what it achieves across such a fundamental epistemic barrier. The philosopher and cognitive scientist Francisco Varela called this the interpersonal dance. The way that two nervous systems, each generating its own model of the other, enter a kind of mutual calibration, adjusting, responding, feeding back, adjusting again, that produces something that feels like understanding without ever being complete access. The dance is real, the music is shared, but the experience of dancing is still private to each dancer. The question of whether you can truly know yourself is ancient, and the answer philosophy has converged on across very different traditions is something like, more than you currently do, less than you think you do, and never completely. The Delphic maxim, know thyself, was carved into the temple of Apollo at Delphi, and the Greeks understood it not as an instruction with a clear completion, as though knowing yourself were a task you could finish, but as an ongoing orientation, a direction rather than a destination. Socrates built his entire philosophical project around it, not because he thought full self-knowledge was achievable, but because he thought the pursuit of it was the most important thing a person could do with their life. And his pursuit led him not to certainty, but to the discovery of ignorance, the famous Socratic discovery that what he knew was how much he did not know. This is not a failure. Socrates did not experience it as a failure. He experienced it as the beginning of genuine inquiry, the precondition for real thinking, which is thinking that has not yet closed itself around a conclusion. The Stoics took a more systematic approach. Marcus Aurelius, in his private journal, a document written for no audience but himself, discovered and published centuries after his death, returned again and again to the project of self-examination. He was interested not in discovering some hidden authentic self beneath the social persona, but in checking his own reasoning, catching his own errors, noticing where his judgments had been distorted by desire or fear, or the opinions of others. Self-knowledge, in the Stoic framework, is primarily the knowledge of one's own biases, the places where the mind deceives itself, where the emotion dresses itself as reason, where the preference masquerades as principle. This kind of self-knowledge is genuinely achievable to a degree. It is also never finished, because the same faculty you're using to examine your biases is itself subject to biases. The lens that studies the lens is itself a lens. There is no view from nowhere. There is no standpoint outside your own consciousness from which you can assess your consciousness completely. The philosopher Charles Taylor, in his book Sources of the Self, argues that human identity is always constituted in dialogue, that the self does not exist prior to its relationships and its language and its cultural context, but emerges from and through them. To know yourself, in Taylor's account, is not to discover a pre-existing essence. It is to articulate, with increasing clarity and honesty, what you care about, what orients you, what gives your life its particular shape and direction, and this articulation is never complete, because the caring and the orienting are themselves in motion. They change as you change, as the relationships change, as the language available to you changes. This is, I think, one of the most honest accounts of self-knowledge ever developed. It takes seriously both the reality of the self. There really is a you with a specific history and specific values and a specific way of being in the world, and the limits of self-knowledge. This you is never fully transparent to itself, is never finished being formed, is always in some respects ahead of your understanding of it. The self you will be in 5 years is already becoming. It is not yet visible to you. The person who will look back on tonight, on this particular dark, on whatever this hour contains for you, will know something about tonight that you cannot know yet. They will see it with the retrospective clarity that only time makes possible, and what they see will surprise you, if you were watching. There's a question that runs underneath the philosophical problem and underneath the neuroscience. A question that is older than either of them, and that every person who has ever tried to be truly close to another person has encountered. Why is it so difficult to say what you actually mean? Not the difficulty of finding the right words, though that is real. The deeper difficulty, the experience of having something inside you, a feeling, a perception, a quality of awareness, a way of being moved by something that seems to resist translation into any language you have available. The experience of interior life that exceeds the vocabulary for describing it. The sense that what you could say, even if you said it perfectly, would still be a version, a reduction, a translation, a map of something that is not the map but the territory. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote, at the end of his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." He meant this technically about the limits of logical language, but the sentence has always been read as something broader because it speaks to an experience almost everyone recognizes, the experience of the genuinely unsayable, of things that are real, that are present, that matter, and that language cannot reach. The philosopher and novelist Iris Murdoch spent much of her career arguing that moral life is primarily about perception, the quality of attention you bring to other people, the accuracy with which you see them as they are, rather than as you wish them to be. And she was consistently honest about how difficult this is. The obstacles to clear seeing in Murdoch's account are internal rather than external. They are the distortions of ego, the self-protective interpretations, the need to make others fit into the story you are already telling, the almost universal tendency to see other people as instruments in your own drama, rather than as protagonists in theirs. The path toward genuine knowledge of another person, in Murdoch's framework, requires first the unselfing of the perceiver, the quieting of the ego's noise enough that the other person can become visible in their own right. And this unselfing is not something achieved once and maintained. It requires ongoing practice, ongoing vigilance against the self's persistent tendency to colonize its perceptions. Even at its best, what you can see of another person is a view from a particular angle, at a particular moment, through a particular lens. The view can be accurate, it can be deep, it can be an act of genuine love and genuine attention, and it will still be partial. It will still be missing whatever is not visible from where you stand. This is not a counsel of despair. Murdoch did not believe that the difficulty of seeing clearly was a reason to stop trying. On the contrary, the difficulty was precisely what made the effort worthwhile. The partial, effortful, always incomplete knowledge of another person that genuine attention produces is, she believed, one of the primary goods of human life, not in spite of its incompleteness, because of the kind of striving that the incompleteness requires. The psychologist Dan McAdams has spent his career studying what he calls the narrative self, the story a person constructs over the course of their life to give their experience coherence and meaning. McAdams argues that identity is not a fixed essence discovered through introspection, but a narrative achievement, something constructed and revised across time, shaped by the stories a person tells about themselves and the stories others tell about them. The narrative self is the self that appears in conversation, in autobiography, in the account you give of your life when someone asks. It is real. It is meaningful. It is also partial. It is the version of yourself that is available to language, the version that has been organized into sequences and causes and meanings that can be communicated. The rest, the pre-narrative experience, the layer of life that exists before and beneath the story told about it, is not in the narrative. It cannot be because narrative requires selection and organization and the imposition of form on what was formless. The therapist and philosopher Eugene Gendlin developed a method he called focusing, based on his observation that the most important information about a person's psychological life is often not available in the form of clear thoughts or feelings that can be easily articulated. It is available instead as what he called a felt sense, a bodily, holistic quality of a situation or problem that is felt before it is understood, that resists immediate translation into language, that requires a specific kind of patient attention to allow to speak. Focusing is the practice of attending to this felt sense without immediately converting it into language or concept, of staying with the not yet said long enough that it can begin to find its own words in its own time. And what Gendlin found, working with thousands of clients over decades, was that this layer, the layer below the narrative, below the concepts, below the story already told, was often where the most important psychological material lived, the feeling that the person had not been able to say, even to themselves, the knowledge that had been waiting, below articulation, for the right quality of attention. If this layer exists in every person, and Gendlin's clinical evidence suggests it does, then the conversation you have with another person, however long, however intimate, however honest on both sides, is a conversation between two narrative selves. It is real, and it is genuinely communicative, and it builds something between two people that matters. But it is a conversation happening above the felt sense, above the pre-articulate, above the layer where the experience lives before language reaches it. What you hear from another person is what they have managed to translate. What they have not managed to translate. What exists below the translation, waiting, you will not hear. Not because they are withholding it, because they have not yet found the words. Because some of it may not have words. Because the translation is always partial, always a version, always a reduction of an interior that does not fully fit in any available container. The writer Virginia Woolf was preoccupied across her entire body of work with the question of what passes between people and what does not. Her novels, Mrs. Dalloway to The Lighthouse, The Waves, are sustained experiments in the representation of interior life in the attempt to find a prose that could hold the texture of consciousness as it actually occurs, rather than as conventional narrative represents it. In Mrs. Dalloway, we inhabit the minds of characters as they move through a single day in London. We are inside Clarissa Dalloway's consciousness as she prepares for her party, inside Septimus Warren Smith's consciousness as he moves toward his death. We see from inside what each of them is experiencing. And we also see through the fact that they never meet, that their streams of consciousness run parallel without touching, how completely the interior of one person is sealed from the interior of another. Woolf said in a letter, "I thought how unpleasant it is to be locked out, and I thought how it is worse, perhaps, to be locked in." She was talking about a specific experience, but the observation has a general truth. To be opaque to others is, in one sense, a form of freedom. The interior that no one else can access is also the interior that no one else can invade. The unknowable self is also the protected self. This is a dimension of human unknowability that is often missed in discussions that treat the opacity between people only as a problem. The privacy of the interior. The fact that there is a you that no one else can fully reach is also one of the few remaining guarantees of genuine selfhood. In a world that increasingly reaches into the interior through data and behavior tracking and the social pressure to share everything, the irreducible privacy of consciousness is not a limitation, but a refuge. There are things about you that no algorithm will ever know. Not because the algorithm is insufficiently sophisticated, though current algorithms are insufficiently sophisticated, but because some aspects of your experience are simply not available in the behavioral data that algorithms observe. The quality of your attention in a particular moment, the specific feeling of a particular memory, the private meaning you have made of something that in behavioral terms looks like nothing at all. These are not data points. They are experiences. And experience in its full subjectivity is not reducible to data. This is not a technological claim. It is not about what current technology can or cannot do. It is a philosophical claim about the nature of experience. The what it is like is not a quantity. It is not a measurement. It is not a pattern in behavior. It is the interior itself, present only to the consciousness that is having it, irreducible to any external representation. You contain things that no one will ever know. Not all of these things are important. Most of them are the small, passing, utterly ordinary texture of a life, the half-formed thought, the brief sensation, the mood that lasted an hour and left no trace. But some of them are significant. Some of them are the truest things about you, and they are yours in a way that nothing external to consciousness can ever be. The existentialist philosophers of the mid-20th century approached the question of unknowability from a different angle, and their approach is darker and in some ways more honest about the cost. Jean-Paul Sartre's analysis of human relations is, famously, grim. In Being and Nothingness, he argues that the fundamental structure of the relationship between persons is one of objectification, the other person's gaze. The fact that they can see you, can form judgments about you, can fix you in their perception as a particular kind of being, is experienced as a threat to your freedom. The other person's consciousness turns you from a free subject into an object of their perception, and your consciousness does the same to them. This is the structure behind his most notorious line. From the play No Exit, Hell is Other People. The line is usually read as a counsel of misanthropy. In context, it is an analysis. The hell Sartre's characters inhabit is the hell of being permanently visible to consciousnesses that will forever see them as objects, forever construct them according to interpretations they cannot control or escape. The hell is not the company of other people. It is the impossibility of being fully free, fully subject, in the presence of other people who are themselves subjects. Sartre's analysis reveals something real about the experience of being partially known and partially misknown by others, the discomfort of being seen as something slightly other than what you feel yourself to be, the impossibility of fully controlling the image you project, the way that other people's perceptions of you create a version of you that is real in its social consequences, but wrong in its details. We all live with the versions other people have made of us. We live with them the way we live with weather. We cannot choose it, We cannot fully change it. We can only navigate it, but Sartre's account is incomplete. And the place where it is most incomplete is in what it leaves out of love, because love, genuine love, the kind that has lasted long enough to have encountered disillusionment and remained, involves something that Sartre's framework struggles to accommodate: the acceptance of being partially misknown, the willingness to love not the perfect knowledge of a person but the ongoing project of knowing them better, the peace that comes from understanding that neither you nor the beloved will ever be fully transparent to each other, and that this is not a failure but the actual condition of human intimacy. The philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, who was Sartre's partner and intellectual interlocutor for decades, and who knew, better than most, what it was like to be in a relationship with someone who theorized the impossibility of genuine connection while practicing it, wrote about love in ways that Sartre's framework does not anticipate. She was interested in what she called the ambiguity of the human condition, the fact that we are both subjects and objects simultaneously, both free and constrained, both the perceivers and the perceived. The ambiguity is not a problem to be resolved. It is the structure of a life lived among other people. The love that can hold the ambiguity, that can love another person as both a subject with an inaccessible interior and an object who is present and visible, and here is, de Beauvoir suggested, a more mature and more sustaining love than the love that demands complete transparency. The demand for complete transparency is, in her analysis, a form of the desire to possess, to convert the other person from a subject into an object that you can fully comprehend and therefore fully control. But the subject cannot be fully comprehended. The interior cannot be fully accessed. The love that demands this will always be frustrated, and the frustration will, if unexamined, curdle into resentment. The love that has made peace with opacity, that loves what it can know, that holds what it cannot know with something like reverence rather than anxiety, is the love that can last. Not because it has given up on knowing the beloved, but because it has understood that knowing the beloved is an endless project, not a destination, and has found in the endlessness not disappointment, but life. There is a specific kind of grief associated with the death of someone close to you that takes many people by surprise because it arrives alongside the grief for the loss as a distinct and separate grief for a different kind of loss. It is the grief for the conversations that will not now happen, not the conversations that were had and are now memories, the conversations that were never had, that you kept meaning to have, that you knew were needed, that you put off for no particular reason, or for the very particular reason that they would require going somewhere difficult, and now cannot happen because the person is gone. The writer Julian Barnes, in his memoir about grief, describes the specific horror of this. The finalization of not knowing. As long as the person is alive, there is always the possibility, tomorrow, next month, some future occasion that hasn't arrived yet, of asking the question you have been carrying, of saying the thing you have not yet found words for. Death removes this possibility. The questions will not be answered. The conversations will not be had. Whatever the person contained that you did not know, you will not now know it. Barnes describes this as one of the shapes that grief takes. The grief not for what was lost, but for what was never had. The intimacy that was almost achieved and then foreclosed. The version of the person you were moving toward and did not reach. This grief is different from the grief of loss, and it requires a different kind of reckoning. It requires the acknowledgement that you will never know the person you loved as fully as you wanted to. Not because death came early, but because full knowledge was never available. The grief is partly grief for an impossibility that death has made explicit. And making it explicit is painful, but it is also, in time, clarifying. Because once you have grieved the impossibility of full knowing, once you have sat with the grief long enough to understand it as something other than a failure, as a structural feature of human relationship rather than a particular tragedy of this particular relationship, something changes in how you hold the living people you love. You stop waiting to fully know them before fully loving them. You stop treating the mystery as a problem to be solved before the relationship can arrive at its real depth. You understand that the depth is already there and that you are already in it, and that the mystery is part of the depth and not an obstacle to it. The philosopher Martin Heidegger wrote about what he called Dasein, being there, his word for human existence, and one of the features of Dasein that most concerned him was its tendency toward inauthenticity. The tendency to live according to the expectations and norms of Das Man, the they, the anonymous social world, rather than according to one's own authentic possibilities. The authentic self, in Heidegger's account, is not a hidden essential self waiting to be discovered. It is a mode of existence, a way of being that owns its own possibilities, that is not defined by the need to be understood by others, that can live with the knowledge of its own finitude without flinching. What Heidegger's framework implies for the question of being known is this: The demand to be fully known by others, the need to be completely understood, completely seen, completely comprehended by someone outside yourself, can be a form of inauthenticity. It is the search outside yourself for the validation that authenticity requires you to find inside. The authentic person does not need to be fully known by another. They have made peace with being a mystery, even to themselves. And from that peace, they can relate to others not from need but from genuine desire, not because they require the other's knowledge of them to exist, but because the other is there and interesting and worth knowing. I want to say something about language, because language is the primary tool we use to bridge the gap between people, and it is worth understanding both what it achieves and what it cannot. Language is extraordinary. It is one of the most sophisticated cognitive achievements of any species on this planet. The fact that you can have an experience, a specific, rich, private, subjective experience, and find words for it, and say those words to another person, and have that person understand something genuine about your experience, this is not a small thing. It is, when you think about it from the outside, rather miraculous. But language achieves its communication by working at the level of shared reference, not private experience. When I say grief, you understand what I mean not because you have access to my grief, but because you have your own grief, and we have agreed to use the same word for the family of experiences we each associate with that word. The communication is real, the sharing is real, but what is shared is not the experience. What is shared is the reference. The philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer, who spent his career developing what he called philosophical hermeneutics, the theory of understanding and interpretation, described genuine communication as the fusion of horizons. Each person brings to a conversation their own horizon, their history, their assumptions, their way of seeing the world, the framework within which things make sense. Genuine understanding between people is not the erasure of these horizons. It is not one person becoming the other or adopting the other's perspective wholesale. It is the creation of a shared horizon that neither person had before, a space of meaning that is built between two people through the encounter. This is a generous and I think accurate account of what happens at its best in conversation. But it also makes clear what does not happen. The horizons do not merge. They fuse at the surface while remaining distinct at their depth. The shared space that conversation creates is real. The private depths that remain below that shared space are also real. Poetry, more than any other form of language, has always been the attempt to close this gap, not to eliminate it. The great poets have always known this was impossible, but to bridge it more narrowly than ordinary language can. The compressed, resonant, intentionally ambiguous language of poetry invites the reader to bring their own experience to the words, to be moved by the same configuration of language in ways that are simultaneously shared. We both feel it. We both recognize it, and private, what you feel when you read it is not identical to what I feel. What I recognize is not identical to what you recognize. This is why great poetry feels both universal and intimate. It speaks to something widely shared while touching something specifically yours. It does not know you fully. It knows a shape that fits you. And you receive it as knowledge of yourself, even though it was made by someone who had never met you. This gap, the gap that poetry tries to bridge and cannot close, is the same gap that runs through every conversation, every letter, every attempt to say what you mean and be understood as you mean it. The gap is permanent. The bridging is worth everything. The Japanese have a word, ma, that describes the meaningful pause, the significant emptiness, the space between things that is not nothing. It appears in architecture, in music, in the tea ceremony, in calligraphy, the space between two walls, the silence between two notes, the interval between two words in a poem. Ma is not the absence of something. It is a presence of its own kind, the presence of space, of possibility, of what is not yet said or done or decided. I think the gap between people, the space that makes full knowing impossible, has something of Ma about it. It is not only loss, it is also the space in which imagination operates, in which love keeps reaching, in which the mystery of the other person keeps generating the desire to know them more. It is the space in which, if you are patient and quiet enough, you can sometimes hear something from another person that they did not say out loud. The philosopher and psychologist William James wrote about what he called the stream of consciousness, the continuous flowing associative movement of thought that is the actual texture of mental life, as opposed to the frozen, discrete propositions that logic and language tend to impose on it. The stream, James noted, is always personal, always mine, always yours. The streams run alongside each other, close enough to hear the sound of each other, not close enough to merge. What flows past in another person's stream? The half-thought, the passing image, the brief feeling that will never become a sentence, is not available to you. You are standing on the bank. You can see the surface. Occasionally something rises to the top and you can name it. But the full current, the full temperature, the full moving life of it, this belongs to them. The psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott, who worked with children and adults for decades and wrote about the nature of the self with unusual clarity and unusual warmth, described what he called the true self and the false self. The false self is the self that has been organized around the expectations of others, the self that has learned to present in ways that produce approval, acceptance, survival. It is not dishonest, exactly. It is protective. It is the interface between the interior and the world. The true self is what exists below the interface. It is spontaneous, unorganized, not yet shaped for presentation. It is not necessarily consistent or coherent. It is the raw material of personhood, the experience that has not yet been processed into narrative, the feeling that has not yet been translated, the selfhood that exists before the self becomes performed. Winnicott argued that the goal of good enough development, a phrase he used to describe parenting and therapy that supported rather than distorted the child's growth, was to create conditions in which the true self could exist without being too completely suppressed by the false self. Not the elimination of the false self, which serves important functions, but the maintenance of enough space for the true self to have a life. What this implies for the question of being known is important. The true self, by Winnicott's account, is not fully communicable. It is the part of the person that exists below communication, below presentation, below the interface that makes social life possible. The most intimate knowledge of another person, the knowledge that comes from years of genuine closeness, genuine attention, genuine willingness to receive what the other person brings, may approach the true self. But it will not arrive at it completely, because the true self is not organized for arrival. It is organized for being. This is, I think, one of the most honest accounts of intimacy that the psychological literature offers. It says, you can get very close. You can build something real and lasting and profoundly meaningful. You can know another person in ways that transform both of you, and you will not know them completely. The true self will always retain a core that is not available even to the most loving and attentive observer. This is not a failure. It is the actual structure of human intimacy. Let us talk about what this means for love, because love is where the question becomes most urgent and the stakes become most felt. The philosopher and writer Alain de Botton has described falling in love as, among other things, the experience of feeling fully known for the first time, or feeling as though you might finally be fully known, for the first time, by another person. The early phase of love has this quality of radical visibility. You feel seen, felt, understood in ways that ordinary life does not provide. The beloved seems to perceive you directly, to reach past the performances and the habits and the accumulated residue of your social self, to touch something more essential. This experience is real, but de Botton argues, and I think he is right, that what is happening is not actually complete knowledge. What is happening is that the beloved is paying a quality of attention that most people rarely receive. The attention of someone who is genuinely interested in you, who finds you compelling, who is bringing all of their perceptive capacity to the project of understanding you. This attention feels like being known, because it is closer to genuine attention than most of what we receive in ordinary social life. But the knowledge is still partial. The early lover is not seeing all of you. They are seeing the parts of you that your current emotional state allows to surface, filtered through their own desires and projections. The feeling of being fully known is partly the feeling of attention, which is rare enough to feel like revelation. What happens next in a relationship? What must happen, if the relationship is going to have depth rather than only heat, is the encounter with the partiality. The moment when the beloved turns out to be different, in some specific way, from the person the lover had been knowing. The moment when a room opens that was not on the map. The moment when the projection meets the reality and must yield. This moment is the real beginning of love, not the end, the beginning, because the love that can survive the revelation that the beloved is more complicated, more opaque, more irreducibly themselves than the love had initially accommodated. This love is the love that has moved from infatuation to something more durable. It has moved from loving an image to loving a person. From loving what you could know to loving, with appropriate humility, what you cannot. The theologian Martin Buber described the fundamental distinction between I-thou and I-it relationships, An I-it relationship is one in which the other is treated as an object, as a means to an end, as something to be used or comprehended or manipulated. An I-thou relationship is one in which the other is met as a genuine subject, as a center of experience and freedom that cannot be reduced to your knowledge of them. That exceeds any category you could put them in. That makes infinite demands precisely because they are not an object. The I-thou relationship, in Buber's account, cannot be sustained continuously. It arises in moments of genuine meeting, genuine recognition of the other as other, and then recedes back into the ordinary modes of interaction. But the moments are real, and they are transformative, and they accumulate over the course of a long relationship into something like a history of encounters with another person's genuine selfhood. What Buber is pointing at is that the gap, the unknowability that we have been exploring, is precisely what makes the I-thou possible. If you could fully know another person, they would not be thou. They would be it. They would be comprehensible, exhaustible, reduced to what you know of them. The genuine thou is the person who exceeds your knowledge, who cannot be fully captured, who keeps surprising you, who remains, even after decades, at least partly a mystery. The mystery is not an obstacle to intimacy. The mystery is what intimacy is reaching toward, and the reaching never ends. That is the point. There are people who read too much into this, who hear it as permission for emotional unavailability, as philosophical cover for the refusal to be vulnerable, as a justification for the walls they have built and maintained through the argument that since full knowing is impossible, all knowing is equally invalid. This is a misreading, and it is worth addressing directly. The impossibility of full knowledge is not the same as the impossibility of meaningful knowledge. The fact that you cannot reach the bottom of a lake does not mean that the lake has no bottom. The fact that you cannot fully know another person does not mean that knowing them better is not worth pursuing, that vulnerability is not worth the cost, that the walls you build for protection are not also walls that keep out the light. The philosopher Gillian Rose, writing while dying of cancer with an unusual fierce clarity, described what she called the work of love. Not love as a feeling that arrives and sustains itself passively, but love is an ongoing, difficult, morally serious practice of seeing another person more clearly than your own ego wants to see them. The work of love requires precisely the willingness to be vulnerable, to be partially known and to accept partial knowing, to show the rooms that are difficult to show and to look into the rooms that are difficult to look into. This work is hard. It is harder than simply maintaining the idea that full knowing is impossible and therefore all attempts are equally valid. It requires something from you that many people prefer not to give. The willingness to be seen inaccurately and to correct the misperception. The willingness to say, I don't think you understand this about me, which requires first having attended carefully enough to know what is being misunderstood. The asymptote, the mathematical term for a line that approaches a limit without ever reaching it, is a useful image here. The limit of full mutual knowing is never reached, but the approach toward it is not random. Two people who have spent years in genuine mutual attention, genuine mutual vulnerability, genuine care for the accuracy of their knowledge of each other are closer to the limit than two people who have spent years in the same room without looking. The gap remains. Its width varies enormously. The question is not whether you can close it. You cannot. The question is what kind of effort you're willing to make toward it, knowing it will never be completed. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, in a letter that has been quoted so many times it has become almost a cliché, but which becomes newly startling when you read it in the context of everything we have been discussing tonight. I hold this to be the highest task for a bond between two people, that each protects the solitude of the other. He was writing to a young man who had asked about love and marriage, and what he said was not, as you might expect, about the closing of distance between people. He said the highest task is the protection of distance, the protection of the other person's solitude, their interior life, their private selfhood, their irreducible otherness from the appetite of love itself, which wants to absorb, to know completely, to dissolve the boundary between self and other. Rilke had understood something that most writing about love does not quite arrive at, that the loved person's mystery is not a problem you should solve. It is a reality you should respect, and respecting it means not treating it as a failure of communication or a deficit of intimacy, but as the simple, irreducible fact that the person you love is a person, a center of experience and freedom and depth that cannot be fully mapped from outside. To protect another person's solitude is to protect their unknowability, to say, I know you are more than I can see, and I am at peace with this, and I love you not in spite of what I cannot see, but including it. This is, I think, one of the most demanding things it is possible to say to another person, and one of the most generous. We are arriving, slowly, at the place where the philosophy and the personal experience, and the neuroscience and the literature all converge, not at a conclusion. This subject does not have a conclusion, at a resting place. The resting place is this: to be not fully known is not a deficiency. It is the actual condition of being a person, and it carries with it both a loss and a freedom, both a loneliness and a protection, both the ache of never being completely seen and the relief of never being completely exposed. You contain depths that no one will reach. There are versions of your experience, specific moments, specific feelings, specific ways of being moved by things that exist only in your consciousness and will end when your consciousness ends. This is true of everyone. It is true of the people you love most. It is true of the people who have most shaped you. It is true of every person who has ever lived. The philosopher Derek Parfit, who spent much of his career thinking about personal identity, about what makes a person the same person over time, about what matters in survival, described, near the end of his life, an experience that had changed his relationship to his own separateness. He had stopped believing, he wrote, that his own existence was what mattered most. He had come to see himself as less separate, as part of something larger, continuous with other people and with the world in ways that made the boundary between self and other seem less fixed. He described this not as a mystical experience, but as a logical conclusion that he had finally allowed himself to feel as well as think, and he said that it had made the world seem more beautiful. Not less lonely, exactly. The separateness was still real, but less threatening. If the boundaries of the self are less absolute than ordinary experience suggests, then the fact that those boundaries cannot be fully crossed from outside is less like imprisonment and more like the natural shape of consciousness. I do not know if Parfit was right. The question of the boundaries of the self is genuinely difficult, and I do not want to resolve it too quickly in either direction. But I find his response to the question, the movement from anxiety about separation towards something like acceptance, towards something like peace, worth sitting with. Because the anxiety about not being fully known and not fully knowing others is in part the anxiety of a self that believes its separateness is the most important thing about it. A self that experiences the gap between people as primarily a threat. A self that wants to close the gap and suffers from not being able to. And the alternative. The self that has made peace with the gap, that finds in the mystery of other people not only loss but wonder, that can love across unknowability rather than only in spite of it. This self is not less intimate, it is more free. Tonight, wherever you are, there are people who love you who do not fully know you. There are things about you that exist only in your own experience, memories that no one has, feelings that have never been named, ways of being moved by things that are entirely yours, that no description has ever captured, that will dissolve when you dissolve. This is not sad, or it is sad and something else simultaneously. Something that does not have a clean name, but that has the quality of weight and worth, of the kind of thing you carry, not because it is comfortable, but because it is real. The people who love you have made their maps of you. The maps are detailed and loving and based on years of careful attention, and they are wrong in specific ways that neither you nor they will ever fully identify. The map is not the territory. They know this if they are paying attention. And they love the territory, not only the map. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas said that love is the opening onto the infinite. He meant that the face of the other person opens onto a depth that cannot be exhausted. That genuine encounter with another person is always an encounter with something that exceeds your capacity to comprehend it. And this encounter is, in his account, sacred. Not in a religious sense necessarily. In the sense of something that cannot be reduced, that demands to be taken on its own terms, that makes demands that no finite knowledge can satisfy. You are someone's encounter with the infinite. They are yours. The gap is not a failure. The gap is where the love lives. Close your eyes. You are not fully known. You are not fully alone. And the distance between these two facts tonight is the exact size of the life you are living. There is a thought experiment that philosophers of mind use to illustrate the problem of other minds. It goes like this. How do you know that any other person is conscious at all? You know you are conscious. You know it directly from the inside, because consciousness is precisely the having of experience, and you are having it right now. You cannot doubt that there is something it is like to be you, because the doubting is itself an experience, and experience requires consciousness. But the consciousness of other people is not available to you in this way. You infer it. You observe behavior that resembles your own, behavior that you would produce if you were having the experiences that seem to be correlated with such behavior, and you conclude, by analogy, that the other person is having something like the experiences you would be having. The inference is reasonable, it may even be irresistible, but it is an inference, not a direct observation. The philosopher Bertrand Russell called this the argument from analogy. I notice that in my own case, when I am in pain, I produce certain behaviors, wincing, recoiling, crying out. I observe someone else producing those same behaviors. I conclude by analogy that they are in pain. The conclusion is probably right. It is not certain. There is a logical gap between the observed behavior and the inferred experience, and no behavioral evidence can close it. This gap, the gap between observed behavior and inferred interior, is the philosophical formalization of the same gap we have been exploring all evening in more personal terms. The person across the table from you is a hypothesis, an extremely well-supported hypothesis, supported by years of evidence and by the deep evolutionary programming of a social species to assume that members of the same species have roughly similar interiors. But a hypothesis nonetheless. You cannot climb inside another person's consciousness and verify what you find there. Now consider what this means for the most ordinary moments of human relationship.
The conversation you had this morning, the silence that fell between two sentences and that you interpreted one way, and that the other person may have meant completely differently, and that neither of you addressed because the silence passed and something else took its place. The look that you read as annoyance, or as love, or as distraction, and that was perhaps all of these simultaneously, and that perhaps your reading of it influenced what it became. All of our interactions with other people are, at some level, acts of interpretation under conditions of radical uncertainty. We are always reading between the lines of observable behavior for the interior that the behavior expresses, and we are always, to some degree, reading our own experience into the reading, projecting, misreading.
Seeing what we expect or hope or fear. The psychologist Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive behavioral therapy, based his entire therapeutic approach on the observation that people do not respond to reality directly. They respond to their interpretation of reality, and the interpretations are shaped systematically by the schemas, the deep patterns of belief about self and world that were laid down in early experience. The depressed person interprets ambiguous social feedback as rejection. The anxious person interprets uncertainty as threat. The person with a secure attachment interprets the same ambiguous signals very differently. In the domain of knowing other people, this means that what you see when you look at another person is always filtered through your own schemas, your own history, your own patterns of interpretation. You cannot turn the filter off. You can become aware of it. You can work to adjust for it, but it remains. Every model you build of another person is built partly from them and partly from you. The poet John Keats, writing to his brothers in 1817, described a quality he admired in Shakespeare and wanted to cultivate in himself, which he called negative capability, the capacity to remain in uncertainty, in doubt, in mystery, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. The capacity to hold what cannot be resolved without demanding that it resolve. Negative capability is the intellectual virtue most relevant to the question of other minds, and to the question of human knowing generally. The person who can tolerate not knowing, who can be in relationship with another person without needing to have them fully figured out, who can hold the mystery without it producing anxiety, is the person best equipped for the kind of love and friendship that depth requires, because depth requires time. It requires repeated exposure to new facets. It requires the willingness to be surprised to encounter something in another person that your model did not predict and to update the model rather than dismissing the surprise. It requires the patience of someone who understands that they are in the early chapters of a very long book, even if they have known the person for decades. The novelist Henry James, who was, among his many other achievements, one of the most precise analysts of human psychology in the history of fiction, spent his career investigating what he called the germs of human consciousness, the barely visible, barely expressible inward movements that precede thought, that generate feeling, that constitute the actual texture of a person's moment-to-moment experience. His late style, the famous Jamesian difficulty, the sentences that spiral and loop and approach their subject from multiple angles before committing to a formulation, is the record of his attempt to find language adequate to this texture. What James found, through decades of attending to his own consciousness and to the consciousnesses of the people around him, was that the interior is almost always more complex than any description of it. That the feeling you call jealousy, for instance, when you examine it carefully enough, is not a simple thing but a composite of many things. Something that resembles hurt, something that resembles fear, something that resembles a very specific kind of self-consciousness about being the kind of person who feels this, something that wants to be done with the feeling and therefore keeps returning to it, and underneath all of this, something that might be love in a form that is hard to recognize as love. This is what the honest examination of interior life always finds, not the clean, simple, nameable things that language tends to provide when you reach for them, but a tangled, irreducible complexity that no available vocabulary quite fits. You are always more than what you can say about yourself. The gap between your interior and your words for it is permanent and real, and if this is true of your own interior, if the gap between your experience and your description of your experience is this wide, then imagine the gap between your experience and another person's description of it. Imagine how much further the telephone game has gone by the time your interior reaches the other person's model of it. Your experience translated imperfectly into language, transmitted imperfectly through speech or text, received through the filter of the other person's own history and expectations and the limits of their empathy. What arrives is real, and it is connected to the original, and it is not the original. This is not a counsel of silence. It is not a reason to stop speaking or to despair of being understood. It is a reason to speak more carefully, to listen more carefully, to receive what the other person offers with the understanding that it has traveled a long way, and some of it has been lost in transit, and that what has been lost is not nothing, and that what has arrived is not nothing either. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who spent his career thinking about narrative and selfhood and the relationship between the self and the stories we tell about it, described what he called narrative identity, the self as a character in an ongoing story. A story that is partly authored by the self and partly authored by others and partly authored by the circumstances that neither the self nor others can control. The story is always open-ended. It has not reached its conclusion, and the self who is living it is always slightly ahead of the story being told about it, always having experiences that the narrative has not yet caught up with. To know another person is to know the story they are in, and the story is always continuing, and the person is always slightly ahead of any telling of the story. The version of another person that you know is always the version from last chapter. The person themselves is already further on. The Sufi poet Rumi, writing in the 13th century, described the longing for union, for the closing of the distance between the soul and God, or between the self and the beloved, or between any consciousness and what it most deeply seeks, as the fundamental human experience. The reed flute's cry, with which the Mesnavi begins, is the cry of separation. The reed has been cut from the reed bed, and the cry it makes is the cry of the cut. The music is the sound of the gap. The longing is the substance of the song. Rumi was writing about mystical union, and the religious dimension of his work should not be flattened. But what he was also describing, what every serious reader of his poetry eventually arrives at, is something that has no necessary religious content. The observation that the deepest music is made from longing, and that the longing is not resolved by union, because union, if it were achieved, would end the music. The gap between people, the fundamental unknowability that we have been tracing all evening, is a version of this. The longing to know and be known, which is one of the most persistent human experiences, generates the reaching, the effort, the conversation, the letter, the poem, the life's work of trying to say what you mean. The reaching is the substance. The gap that makes the reaching necessary is the source of the music. If you could be fully known, if another person could step inside your consciousness and see everything, understand everything, know every room in you, the longing would end. And the longing, for all its discomfort, is also what keeps you reaching, what keeps you talking, writing, sitting in the particular concentrated silence of genuine listening, what keeps you alive to other people in the way that the fully satisfied are not alive. The philosopher Iris Murdoch wrote, "Love is the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. Not the discovery that something other than yourself exists. That is easy. The realization that it is real, that it has its own center of gravity, its own interior, its own weight of experience that has nothing to do with you. That realization is, in Murdoch's account, the beginning of genuine moral and loving life. You will never fully complete that realization. It is not a realization with an endpoint. It is an ongoing revision in the direction of accuracy. You keep discovering that the person you love is more real, more genuinely other, more genuinely themselves than your current model of them accounts for, and each discovery enlarges the love, if the love is the kind that can bear enlargement. Most loves can. The ones that cannot are the ones that were, at some level, love for an image rather than a person. What makes this even more interesting is that the mystery does not only exist in the present moment. It stretches through time itself. I want to end with something small. There is a moment that happens sometimes in long relationships, long friendships, long marriages, long partnerships of any kind, that is different from the dramatic moments, the conversations that change things, the moments of profound mutual recognition. It is not a dramatic moment. It is ordinary to the point of invisibility. You are in the same room. You are not talking. One of you is reading, or looking out the window, or doing nothing in particular. And you look at the other person, not with any specific intention, not looking for anything, just looking. And for a brief moment you see them as a person rather than as your person, as a specific, irreducible human being who has been alive for all these years in ways you have not seen, who has thoughts you have not heard, who has a whole interior weather system operating continuously alongside yours and mostly invisible to yours. And the person you love, seen this way, seen for a moment as the stranger they have always also been, is more interesting, more real, more worth loving than the familiar version. Not because the familiar version is false, because the familiar version is a projection onto someone who keeps exceeding it. You will never fully know them. You have been married to a mystery for 20 years, for 30 years, for a whole life. The mystery has not grown smaller. If you have been paying attention, it has grown larger. This is not a problem. This is a life, and it is a more generous life, I think, than the life of someone who believes they have arrived at full knowledge and stopped looking. The philosopher William James, who had a gift for landing on the exact phrase for difficult things, wrote, "The greatest revolution of our generation is the discovery that human beings, by changing the inner attitudes of their minds, can change the outer aspects of their lives." He was writing about agency and belief and the power of perspective, but the claim applies here too, in a way he might not have intended. The revolution of accepting unknowability, of changing the inner attitude from anxiety about the gap to something like wonder at it, changes what a relationship feels like from the inside. It changes what it means to sit in a room with another person. It changes what you're reaching for when you speak. You're not trying to arrive at complete knowledge. You're not trying to close a gap that will not close. You are doing something different, something that has no endpoint, and therefore never exhausts itself. You are paying attention to another person who exceeds your attention, who will always in some specific and significant way surprise you. And being surprised, being genuinely surprised, for the 1,000th time, by someone you have known for decades, is one of the small, permanent, unreasonably beautiful features of being human. You are not fully known. You are not fully alone. The dark is the same dark everywhere tonight, and somewhere in it, someone is thinking about you in a way you will never know, and somewhere in it, you are thinking about someone in a way that will never quite reach them. The distance between you is real. The reaching across it is also real. There is a peculiar feature of human memory that bears directly on the question of being known. We do not remember experiences. We remember the last time we remembered them. The psychologist Elizabeth Loftus has spent decades demonstrating, with clinical precision, that human memory is not a recording device. It is a reconstructive process. Each time you recall a memory, you are not playing back a stored file. You are rebuilding the memory from available material, from fragments, from emotion, from the context of the current moment, from things you have since learned that were not part of the original experience. And in the rebuilding, things change, details shift, edges soften or sharpen. The emotional tone adjusts to fit the story you are currently telling about the past. This means that the version of you that your oldest friend carries in their memory is not the version of you that existed at the moment they are remembering. It is a reconstruction, shaped by everything that has happened since, by the current state of the relationship, by the specific concerns of the person doing the remembering. They are remembering a version of you that has been revised by every subsequent encounter, every conversation since, every update to their model of who you are, and you are doing the same to them. The person you remember is not the person who was there. It is the person who was there as reconstructed by everything that came after. This might seem to make things worse, another layer of distortion, another distance between the self and how it is known. But there is something quietly consoling about it, too. The version of you that lives in another person's memory is not fixed. It is living, changing, growing, being updated by ongoing experience. The you that exists in your oldest friend's mind has aged alongside you, has been revised by every year of your continued relationship, is, in a specific sense, still becoming. You are not only a fixed past in the minds of the people who love you, you are a continuing project. The philosopher Henri Bergson made the duration of experience, what he called durée, central to his philosophy. For Bergson, the tendency to treat time as a series of discrete, measurable instants was a conceptual error that missed the actual character of experience, which is flowing, continuous, irreducibly temporal. The self, in Bergson's account, is not a thing that exists at an instant. It is a duration, a flowing, continuous, temporally extended process that cannot be fully captured in any snapshot. This applies to the self as known by others. The person another person knows is not a static object. It is a process they are watching unfold. Every new encounter updates the model. Every conversation adds to the history. Every year of shared experience deepens the archive, even as it changes what the archive contains. To be known by another person across many years is to have given them access to a duration of yourself, a stretch of the flowing self that no single moment can contain. This is a form of intimacy that is different from the intensity of early knowing. It is broader rather than deeper, temporal rather than immediate. It is the intimacy of being witnessed over time, of having someone who has seen you across many different seasons of your life and who holds the whole arc rather than only the current moment. This kind of knowing is, perhaps, the closest humans get to the full knowledge that the philosophical arguments suggest is impossible, not because it eliminates the gap, but because the gap across time is narrowed by the accumulation of evidence, by years of watching, listening, being present for the full range of what a person is across their unfolding. And still, even here, the gap remains. The old friend who has known you for 30 years is carrying a version of you that is not you, that is shaped by what they needed from you, what they feared about you, what they loved in you, what they could not quite see. They have their blind spots, you have yours. And the 30 years have been 30 years of two people constructing and revising their models of each other in the adjacent chambers of two separate, permanently private consciousnesses. They know you well. They do not know you fully. Both things are true, and neither cancels the other. And once we accept that another person can never be fully captured, a different question emerges. What allows love to keep growing anyway? The writer James Baldwin, who spent his life investigating the ways that human beings fail to see each other clearly, and the particular politically charged ways in which this failure has shaped American history, wrote something about love that I have never been able to shake. He wrote, "Love does not begin and end the way we seem to think it does. Love is a battle, love is a war, love is a growing up." He was writing about the specific difficulty of love across the distances that race and history and power create between people, distances that make the ordinary difficulties of human opacity more charged and more consequential. But the sentence applies beyond its original context, and it applies with particular precision to the question we have been living inside tonight. Love is a growing up. Not a growing together, not a growing into each other, but a growing up. A movement toward a maturity of vision that can hold the other person in their full, irreducible reality rather than in the simplified image that the beginning of love provides. The maturing of love is the gradual replacing of image with person, the ongoing, difficult, never completed project of seeing the other as they are. This project requires something that does not come easily to most people, and that the culture does not especially encourage: the willingness to be wrong about the person you love. The willingness to encounter evidence that your model is incorrect and to revise the model rather than the evidence. The willingness to say, "I did not understand this about you," and to mean it not as a complaint, but as a recognition, as the acknowledgement that the person has just become slightly more visible. The philosopher Iris Murdoch placed this willingness, what she called unselfing, the quieting of the ego's need to see the world in terms of its own interests and projections, at the center of her moral philosophy. To love well, in Murdoch's account, is to see accurately. And to see accurately requires the constant correction of the self's tendency to see what it wants to see, what it fears, what confirms its existing story. This is demanding. It requires the kind of attention that is, by Murdoch's own account, very rare. But it is the kind of attention that makes love grow rather than simply persist. The love that is still growing, still revising, still being surprised by what it finds. This love is alive. The love that has settled into a fixed model and stopped revising is not dead, but it is no longer growing. It has arrived at a version of the person and stopped reaching. The person you love has not stopped. They are still becoming. The model has to keep moving to keep up with them. That question leads naturally to a broader perspective on identity itself and the boundaries we imagine between ourselves and others. The philosopher Derek Parfit, who thought more carefully than perhaps anyone in the 20th century about the nature of personal identity, described a shift in his own perspective that arrived in middle age and that he described as a form of liberation. He had stopped believing, he wrote, that his own continued existence was the thing that mattered most. He had come to see himself as less separate from other people than he had previously assumed, as part of a larger, continuous flow of consciousness and experience that made the boundary between self and others seem less absolute and therefore less threatening. He wrote, "When I believed that my existence was what mattered, I seemed imprisoned in myself. My life seemed like a glass tunnel, through which I was moving faster every year, and at the end of which there was darkness. And then, my tunnel had become open at both ends." I do not know if Parfit's metaphysics are right. The question of where the self ends and the world begins is genuinely unsettled. But the psychological movement he describes, from the anxiety of separation to something like openness, from the experience of the gap as a wall to the experience of it as a membrane, is worth sitting with regardless of whether the metaphysics behind it can be established. Because the anxiety of not being fully known is, at some level, the anxiety of separation. It is the self's experience of its own boundaries as a kind of imprisonment, as a wall between itself and the full connection it desires. And the alternative that Parfit describes, the shift towards seeing the boundaries as thinner, the self as less isolated than it feels, changes what the gap means without requiring that it close. You are not fully separate from the people you love. You share a language, a history, a body of experience that could not have existed without both of you. The part of you that has been shaped by the people who know you is not a foreign element. It is part of you, and the part of the people who love you that has been shaped by you is part of them. The boundaries are real. They are also, at the edges, permeable. The philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who studied the relationship between consciousness and embodiment, described what he called intercorporeality, the way that bodies that inhabit shared space and shared practices develop a form of knowledge of each other that is not linguistic, not conceptual, but kinesthetic and perceptual. The couple who has lived together for decades navigates each other's presence in a room with a fluency that is not the result of thinking. The long-term collaborators who finish each other's sentences are not reading each other's minds. They are moving in a shared rhythm that has become part of both of them. This is not full knowledge. It is not the direct access to another person's consciousness that the what it is like question reveals to be unavailable. But it is real. It is a form of knowing that operates below language, that accumulates in the body rather than the intellect, that is in some ways more intimate than anything that can be said. We are embodied creatures. And the knowing that accumulates through embodied co-presence, through years of inhabiting the same spaces, moving through the same rhythms, being touched and touching, is a knowing that the philosophical analysis of mind may be underestimating. You may know the people you love, in this embodied pre-linguistic, accumulated sense, far more deeply than any account of what you know about them would suggest. And they may know you the same way, not through a complete model of your interior, but through a kind of attunement that does not require the interior to be fully visible. The body remembers what the mind did not notice. The knowing is there, deeper than you thought, and less verbal than you expected. From there, it becomes possible to ask what genuine connection actually looks like when complete understanding is unavailable. One last thing, and then the silence. The philosopher William James, who had a capacity for seeing ordinary experience with unusual freshness, and who trusted this freshness more than most philosophers have trusted it, wrote near the end of his life about what he called the sentiment of rationality, the feeling of profound rightness that certain ideas produce, the sense that something has been understood that needed to be understood. I have been sitting with a version of this feeling all evening, not a feeling of certainty. The subject is not one that yields certainty, but a feeling of rightness about the inquiry itself, about the importance of taking seriously the fact that we are each mysteries to each other, about what it means to reach across the gap, rather than to pretend the gap is not there. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." She meant something specific by attention, not the casual noticing of everyday life, but the concentrated, ego-quieted, genuinely receptive quality of attention that allows another person to be present to you as they are rather than as you need them to be. She called it the purest form of generosity because it asks you to set aside your own agenda entirely, to be present to what is rather than to what you want, to receive what is offered without immediately translating it into what you already know. This quality of attention, if you can bring it to the people in your life, even occasionally, even imperfectly, is the closest thing available to genuine knowing, not complete knowledge, but the real thing, in the amount it is available. The closest approach to the limit that human attention makes possible. You will not fully know them, they will not fully know you. And between that limit and where you are, there is a distance that love and attention can travel. Not close it, travel. The traveling is the relationship. The traveling never stops if the love is real. Tonight you are lying in the dark, carrying your particular interior, your specific weight of experience, your rooms that no one has entered, your feelings that have no names, your version of the world that exists only behind your eyes. Somewhere someone is lying in the dark carrying theirs, and there is a thread between you. Attention, history, love, whatever word fits, that crosses the gap without closing it. Let that be enough. It is enough. There is a particular experience that comes if you sit with a person in genuine silence for long enough, not the silence that is waiting for the next thing to say, not the silence that is performing comfort, the silence that has settled, the silence between two people who are not managing the moment, but simply in it. In that silence, something shifts. The usual machinery of social interaction, the monitoring of impression, the management of tone, the subtle negotiation of status and warmth and distance, quiets. And what is left is something that does not have a clean name, a sense of co-presence, a sense that the other person is here, genuinely here, in a way that the ordinary social surface does not quite capture. The psychologist Carl Rogers, who developed what he called person-centered therapy, described what he considered the most healing thing one person could offer another, unconditional positive regard. He meant the experience of being accepted as you are, without condition, without evaluation. He believed that this experience, which he thought most people received very rarely, if at all, in the ordinary course of life, was genuinely therapeutic in the clinical sense, that people changed, grew, became more themselves in the presence of someone who received them with this quality of acceptance. What Rogers was describing is not knowledge. It is not the complete understanding of another person, not the full access to their interior, not the resolution of the gap. It is something that operates in the gap, a quality of presence and acceptance that does not require full knowing and is not defeated by its absence. You can be accepted without being fully understood. You can be loved without being fully known. And the acceptance and the love are real, are among the most real things available to human beings, even in the permanent presence of the unknowability that they cross. This is, I think, the piece at the center of the subject we have been circling, not the resolution of the problem. The discovery that the problem does not need to be resolved for the most important things to be true. You can be loved as you are, partially seen, partially understood, always more than the model the other person has built of you, and the love can be genuine, and the partial seeing can be more than enough. The philosopher Martin Buber said that all real living is meeting. He meant the genuine encounter between one being and another, the moment of actual contact across the gap, however brief, however incomplete, however shot through with the inevitability of the gap's return. The meeting is real while it lasts. The gap returns. The meeting remains real. You have had these moments, with people you love and occasionally with strangers, and sometimes alone in the presence of something, a piece of music, a line of poetry, a view that meets you in a way you were not expecting. The moments when the gap between yourself and the world became, briefly, less. These moments do not resolve the question of unknowability. They do not prove that full knowing is possible. They are something else entirely, moments in which the question becomes, for a while, less urgent. Moments in which being partially known in this particular way, by this particular presence, is enough, more than enough. It is everything. Seen this way, the problem begins to look less like a problem and more like a condition of being human. The philosopher Gabriel Marcel, who wrote about what he called the mystery of being, as opposed to problems which have solutions, mysteries are realities that engage us so deeply that we cannot step outside them to solve them, described love as the paradigmatic case of mystery. You cannot solve love. You cannot stand outside it and examine it from a position of detachment. You are inside it, and it is inside you, and the engagement is total, and the resolution is permanently deferred. The same is true of the question of knowing another person. It is not a problem with a solution. It is a mystery in Marcel's sense, a reality that you are inside, that engages you so completely that the question of solving it becomes less interesting than the question of how to live within it well. Living within it well means, I think, something like this: to hold the gap with curiosity rather than anxiety, to understand the partial knowing that is available as genuinely valuable rather than as a pale substitute for the full knowing that is not, to bring to the people in your life the best quality of attention you can manage, not because it will close the gap, but because it will honor what is across it, to be willing to be surprised, repeatedly, over a whole life, by the depth of what you do not know about the people you have loved the longest, and to accept, as an adult accepts a permanent condition of the world rather than a problem to be solved, that there are rooms in everyone you will never enter, including yourself, and that this is not a failure of love or attention or intimacy. It is the shape of consciousness. It is the actual architecture of a life lived among other people who are genuinely other. The gap is real. The love that crosses it is also real. Both can be true. Both are true. Tonight, in whatever bed and whatever dark you are lying in, you carry an interior that no one has fully seen. The depth of what you are is genuine, and it is yours, and it is extraordinary, not because of what it contains, though what it contains is extraordinary, but because it is your consciousness, which is to say it is the thing that makes all experience possible, which is to say it is irreducibly, permanently, yours. No one will ever fully know it. No one will ever fully know you. And the people who love you, who reach toward you across the gap, who have built their imperfect models of you from years of imperfect evidence, they are doing something real, something that matters, something that is worth receiving, even knowing it is partial, even knowing the model is wrong in ways neither of you can see. You are not fully known. You are being loved. For tonight, let that be the same thing. The sociologist Erving Goffman spent his career studying what he called the presentation of self in everyday life. His central observation, developed in the book of that name published in 1959, was that social interaction is fundamentally theatrical. People present versions of themselves in public contexts that are calibrated to produce specific impressions, managed and adjusted in real time based on the responses they receive. Goffman called this impression management, and he described it not as hypocrisy or dishonesty, but as the ordinary, unavoidable, and largely unconscious work that every social actor does every time they enter a public situation. He distinguished between the front stage, the region of behavior that is visible to others, where performance occurs, and the backstage, the region that is hidden from the audience, where the performer can step out of character, drop the managed presentation, and simply be whatever they are when they are not being watched. The backstage is real. It is not the authentic self in some mystical sense. Goffman did not believe in an essential authentic self hiding behind the performance. The backstage is simply the region of behavior that is not currently being managed for impression. It is looser, less controlled, less consistent. It is where people are tired and uncertain and confused and funny in ways they would not choose to be funny in public. And it is largely inaccessible to other people. Even in intimate relationships, even with the people who know us best, the backstage is only partially exposed. There are regions of the backstage that nobody sees, not because we are hiding them in any conscious sense, but because they occur in private moments. In the middle of the night, in the gap between one thought and another, in the 30 seconds before sleep, when the performance machinery has finally shut down, and whatever is left of the self before it started performing is briefly, quietly present. This is the self that the philosophical and contemplative traditions have been trying to point at for centuries, not the authentic self as opposed to the false self. Goffman was right that this distinction is too simple, but the self before presentation, the self that has not yet become its performance, the self that exists in the moment of waking before the day's persona has assembled itself, the self in the dark. You know something of this self in yourself, you have met it in those quiet moments. But you have not met it fully because even in private, the self continues to narrate itself, to interpret itself, to perform for an internal audience that never quite disappears, and no one else has ever met it at all. The people who love you have met many versions of you. The version that appears in different social contexts, the version that appears under stress, and the version that appears at ease, the version that is generous and the version that is small and the version that is frightened. They have met more versions of you than most people have. And from the accumulation of versions, they have built a model that approximates you better than anyone else's model does. But the self in the dark, the self between presentations, the self that exists before the first thought of the morning has organized itself into narrative. This self they have not met, not because they have not tried, not because the relationship is insufficient, because this particular self does not translate. It exists before translation. It is, by its nature, private. This is the deepest version of the claim that no one will ever fully know you. Not that you are hiding something, not that the relationship lacks sufficient depth, not that communication has failed, but that the most interior layer of selfhood, the experiencing before the reporting of experience, the being before the narrative of being is not available for sharing. It is available only for living. And this, finally, is not a loss. It is a form of dignity. The dignity of a consciousness that is its own before it is anyone else's, that has an interior life that belongs to it in a way that nothing else quite belongs to it. That is, at its root, unowned, by anyone, including itself. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas wrote that the face of the other person demands of you an infinite responsibility, a responsibility that exceeds any calculation of what you owe, any balancing of obligation against obligation. He was writing about ethics, about the unlimited demand that another person's vulnerability makes on you. But the word infinite is the key word. The demand is infinite because the other person is infinite. Their depth does not run out. Their interiority cannot be exhausted. To respond to them adequately would require a response that is itself inexhaustible. No one has the capacity for this response, but the orientation toward it, the recognition that the other person exceeds your response to them, that they are always more than you can answer. This orientation is what Levinas called the ethical relationship. It is the relationship that has not reduced the other person to what they are useful for, to what they can be understood as, to what they fit within your existing categories. Every person you have ever met is, in Levinas's sense, inexhaustible. You have not and will not exhaust them. The conversation you have had with any person you know well is a conversation that could continue forever, and still not arrive at the bottom of what they are. The bottom is not available. That is not a limitation of the conversation. It is the character of the person. Yet there is another dimension to this mystery, the way we present ourselves, and the parts of us that remain beyond presentation. The scientist and writer Primo Levi, who survived Auschwitz and spent the rest of his life trying to understand and communicate what that survival meant, wrote about what he called the gray zone, the morally complex territory between victim and perpetrator that the extreme conditions of the camps produced, and that simple moral categories cannot accommodate. His work was consistently, painfully honest about the difficulty of knowing other people in conditions of extreme stress, about the way that identity becomes unstable under pressure, about the limits of any account of a person that does not acknowledge the complexity underneath. He wrote in one of his most famous passages, "I must repeat, we are not the last, nor the first, nor the worst. We are human beings. We are like everyone else. The capacity for good and for evil is in all of us." This is not a comfortable observation. It is an honest one. What Levi was describing is the opacity of the self under conditions that strip away the ordinary social scaffolding through which identity is maintained and communicated. When the scaffolding is gone, what is revealed is not simply the true self. It is the multiplicity and instability of the self. The fact that what we think of as a fixed character is partly a function of the conditions in which it is expressed, partly a function of the stories we tell about it, partly constructed in each moment rather than simply given. This is not a nihilistic observation. Levi was not saying that character is unreal, or that it doesn't matter how you behave. He was saying that the self is more complex, more context-dependent, more difficult to know than the ordinary categories suggest, and that this difficulty applies equally to the self you are trying to know and to the other people you are trying to know. You do not fully know what you would be in other conditions. You do not fully know what the people you love would be in other conditions. This is part of the mystery they carry, and part of the mystery you carry. The self is not a fixed thing that can be fully known if only the observation is sufficiently careful. It is a process that continues to become, and becoming is not fully knowable in advance. This is one more reason why the claim to full knowledge of another person, the sense of having arrived at a complete and final understanding, is always premature. Not because there is something hidden that will eventually be revealed, but because the person is still in motion. They have not finished becoming. The final version of them that you could assess is not yet available, because it will not be available until they have stopped being. And by that time, you will be the one who is remembered, not the one who is doing the remembering. And if the self is always still unfolding, then any attempt to define a person completely will always arrive too early. Wittgenstein wrote, in a late notebook, "The human body is the best picture of the human soul." He meant this as a philosophical claim about the relationship between inner states and outer expression, that the face and posture and gesture are not a screen between you and the person's inner life, but the inner life's natural expression, the form in which it appears in the world. He was pushing back against the philosophical temptation to treat the inner and the outer as entirely separate domains, with the inner as the real thing and the outer as a merely contingent representation of it. The outer is not merely representation. The tear that appears on a face is not merely the representation of grief. It is grief in the form in which grief appears to another person. The laugh is not the representation of delight. It is delight shaped by a body offered to the world. This matters for the question of knowing other people, because it suggests that what you can observe, the face, the voice, the gesture, the posture, the thousand small behavioral signals that people send continuously and largely below conscious awareness, is not separate from the interior. It is the interior, expressed, imperfectly, incompletely, shaped by habit and culture and the particular capacities of the particular body, but genuinely expressive. The person who watches carefully, who has developed the kind of attentive perception that Iris Murdoch was describing, is not observing a screen in front of the real person. They are observing the real person in the form in which the real person is available to observation. The available form is partial. The person behind the available form is more than the form. But the form is not nothing. It is something. It is the closest approach to the other person's reality that their embodied presence makes available. Years of careful attention to another person's face, their voice, the particular way they hold themselves when they are uncertain, or when they are happy, or when they are trying not to be afraid. This is a form of knowing that is real and deep, and not to be dismissed because it does not achieve the impossible standard of complete interior access. It is the knowing that is available. It is the knowing that love builds. It is imperfect and real, and it grows. The same lesson appears from another angle when we look at the ways people reveal themselves through ordinary presence. Let me return at the end to where we began. There is a person I have known for many years. I said this at the start of tonight. I said I do not fully know them. I said I find this, when I sit with it honestly, not lonely but extraordinary. I want to say more precisely what I mean by extraordinary. I mean every conversation with this person has the possibility of surprise. Every year adds something to the archive and also reveals that the archive was incomplete. Every season of their life that I have been present for has shown me something of them that the previous seasons did not predict. The person they are at 40 is not the person I thought I was watching become at 30. The person they will be at 60 is not yet visible, even to them, even though it is already beginning. I have been watching a mystery unfold for years. The mystery has not resolved. It has deepened. And the deepening is not frustrating. Or it is frustrating sometimes, in the ordinary way that intimacy is sometimes frustrating, when the gap between understanding and needing to understand opens too wide. But underneath the frustration which passes, there is something steadier, something that I can only describe as gratitude. Gratitude for the fact that the person I love continues to exceed my knowledge of them, that they are always in some specific way I did not expect, more than I thought, more than any model I have built. More than the story I tell about them to myself and to others. This excess, this permanent, irreducible excess of the person over any account of them, is not an obstacle to love. It is the evidence that the person is genuinely there, that I am loving a real person and not a construction, that what I am reaching toward has not been fully reached, which means it is real enough to keep reaching for. The philosopher Paul Tillich wrote that love is the drive toward the unity of the separated. He was writing from a religious framework, but the observation survives its context. Love is the drive toward unity across a separation that cannot be closed. The drive is real. The separation is real. Both can be true. Both are true. Tonight you are separated from everyone you love by the permanent, structural, philosophically fundamental fact of being a distinct consciousness with an interior that no other consciousness can fully enter. You are separated by the what it is like, by the felt sense that has not found words, by the rooms that have not opened, by the self that exists before presentation and after language and underneath narrative. You are also, across this separation, connected by the reaching, by the imperfect models built with love and attention over years, by the silence between two people that has settled into something real, by the face that Levinas said makes infinite demands, by the duration that Bergson said is the actual texture of living, by every conversation that got close to something important, and by every conversation that will happen tomorrow and in the year after that. You are separated and connected. The separation is real. The connection is real. Let them both be true tonight. Let the dark hold both. Let your breathing slow. Let the words dissolve. You are not fully known. You are not alone in being not fully known. There is a kind of company in that, if you let it be. Good night. There is one more thing that wants to be said, and it is the most personal thing, and I have been circling it all evening. The question of being fully known is not only a philosophical question, it is a question that most people carry personally, as a specific ache, a specific loneliness, that arrives at particular moments. Not constantly, not as a permanent wound, but as an occasional sudden recognition of the gap, the moment in the middle of a dinner party when you realize that none of the people in the room quite know you. Not because they are not paying attention, because you have not been showing them, because some version of you has been managing the evening, and the version that is managing is not the version that is most real. Or the moment in the middle of a long relationship when you realize that the person who knows you best does not know something specific about you that feels important, and that you have not told them, not because you decided not to, but because the opportunity never quite arrived. Because it would require saying something that does not fit the shape of the conversations you have been having. Because by the time you found the words, the moment had passed, and then passed again, and eventually the not said thing became part of the architecture of the self that lives below the relationship, rather than inside it. Most people have things like this, things that have not been said, not secrets exactly. They do not feel like secrets. They do not feel protected. They feel unreachable. They feel like the kind of thing you would say if the conversation ever went exactly far enough in exactly the right direction, but the conversation has not gone there yet and may not. The writer Anne Lamott described what she called the unsent letter, the letter you write in your head to someone, the one that says everything, the one that would leave nothing unsaid, the one you have been composing for years and will never send because once you put it on the page and gave it to them, some version of the gap would close and some version of you would become permanently visible, and the exposure of that visibility is both what you want most and what you most fear. The unsent letter is a form of the unknowability problem. You are carrying information about yourself that another person does not have, that you want them to have, that you have not found a way to give them. The wanting and the not giving exist simultaneously, neither canceling the other. You are choosing to remain partially unknown in this specific way, and also grieving that you are partially unknown. This is not unusual. This is ordinary. This is the texture of being a person in relationship with other people. The letter that does not get sent, the room that does not get opened, the conversation that circles around the thing it is about without quite arriving at it. These are not failures of intimacy. They are the ordinary operations of a consciousness that is always more than what it can say at any given moment. What I have found, sitting with this over many years of attention to what matters and what does not, is that the unsent letters become less burdensome when you accept that the gap they are crossing is not going to close, when you stop holding them in anticipation of the perfect moment and start carrying them more lightly, as the record of your interior rather than the debt you owe to another person. The things about you that no one knows are not failures. They are not evidence that you have been loved insufficiently. They are evidence that you are complex enough to have depths that have not yet been reached, which is another way of saying that you are alive and still becoming. The philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote that action. The way we reveal ourselves in the public world, through word and deed, always reveals more than the actor intends. You never fully control what you show of yourself. The self spills over the edges of its own presentation. Other people see things you do not intend to show, and they miss things you are actively showing. The gap between what you intend to reveal and what is received is permanent and in both directions. This is not only a limitation, it is also a form of grace. The fact that you spill over your own presentation, that you reveal yourself in ways you do not notice and could not control, means that you are more visible than you think you are. The people who love you have seen things in you that you have not seen in yourself. They have built parts of their model of you from evidence you did not know you were providing. You are partially known in ways you are not aware of, as well as partially unknown in ways you have been aware of all evening. Both are true. And the partial knowing that happens without your intention, the seeing of you by someone who is genuinely paying attention, who catches the thing you did not know you were showing, is, in some ways, the most intimate knowing of all, because it is the knowing that does not depend on your performance. It is the knowing of the self before it has assembled itself for presentation. The psychologist John Gottman, who has studied couples for decades and developed a set of principles for what he calls the sound relationship house, describes what he calls knowing your partner's inner world, their dreams, their fears, their histories, their sense of meaning, their private concerns, as the foundation of relationship health. He calls this love maps, the detailed, ongoing, continuously updated map of another person's interior world that a good relationship maintains. The map is never complete, but the commitment to mapping, the orientation of genuine curiosity toward another person's interior, maintained over years, is itself a form of love. The love that says, I know I do not know you fully, and I am still curious. I am still paying attention. I am still interested in what I have not yet seen. Tell me. Show me. Let me update the map. The map I have is the best map I know how to make, and it is wrong in ways I cannot see, and I will keep making it. This is the love that can last, not because it achieves what it sets out to achieve, but because it never stops setting out. The gap remains. The reaching remains. The two can coexist. They have always coexisted. They will coexist for as long as there are people reaching toward each other across the permanent distance of separate consciousnesses, in the dark, at whatever hour this is where you are. You are not alone in this. Not at all. There is a moment, early in any serious relationship, friendship, love, collaboration, whatever the form, when the conversation first goes somewhere that ordinary conversation does not go, when something is said that did not come from the polished surface of social interaction, but from somewhere further back. When the other person says something that you recognize, not as information, but as true in the specific way that things are true when they match something you have been carrying without naming. This moment is, I think, one of the most important experiences available to a human being. Not because it resolves the gap, it does not, but because it reveals that the gap is bridgeable at all. That two people, each carrying their sealed interior, can nonetheless arrive at the same place from different directions, can find in language or in silence a temporary coincidence of recognition that is genuinely shared. These moments do not happen constantly. Even in the best relationships, they are not supposed to happen constantly. If they did, they would lose the quality that makes them what they are, the quality of the unexpected arrival, the sudden and specific feeling of being met. But they happen. They happen often enough, across a life of genuine attention to other people, that the case for unknowability is not the last word. The unknowability is real. So are the moments of meeting. And the meeting happens not despite the gap, but across it. Happens in fact only because the gap is there. Because two distinct consciousnesses, separately formed, separately shaped, carrying their separate histories of interior life, happen to touch at a point of genuine recognition. The philosopher Martin Buber called the space between persons, the space in which the I-thou relationship occurs, the between, not inside one person or the other. Between, the relationship does not live inside you, and it does not live inside the other person. It lives in the space between, in the field of encounter that two people create when they genuinely meet. This between is where everything that matters in human life occurs, not inside the sealed interior, not in the fully private self that no one can reach. In the between, in the space of encounter. In the moment when two people, each carrying their unknowable depths, find the surface at which those depths can touch. You are not fully known, but you have been met at certain moments, in certain conversations, in certain silences, in the particular quality of being held by someone who was genuinely paying attention, in the specific experience of recognition that happens when another person says something that matches the thing you have been unable to say. You have been met in the between. Those meetings are real. They are not the closing of the gap. They are the crossing of it for a moment, in the light of genuine attention. The gap remains. The crossing remains. The self that no one fully knows remains intact and private and irreducibly yours. And the between where meeting happens remains available, as long as there are two people willing to reach toward it. Tonight you are carrying your interior into sleep. The rooms that no one has entered, the feelings that have no names, the specific quality of your consciousness as it moves through this particular dark on this particular night. No one will know exactly what this is like, not fully, not completely, not in the way that you know it from the inside, and somewhere, someone is doing the same, carrying their own sealed interior into their own particular dark, unreached by you, unreachable, and reaching from inside that unreachability toward something, toward morning, toward the person they love, toward whatever the night leaves behind. You are separate, and you are not alone. Rest.